If I wanted to be a dictator and I was the Prime Minister of Canada, I'd likely find the democratic process to be restrictive and cumbersome to my ambitions. No matter how beneficial my proposed policies, there would always be someone squawking in opposition to implementing my vision of what Canada could and should be. If I were Canada's PM, I might admire the efficiency of other governments and systems of governance, which allow their leaders to create the society they believe is best for them. A society of fairness and ecological responsibility is in the best interests of all global citizens, and if the United Nations were in control of the world, I might believe that all would benefit. If my father was a politician, and I grew up without ever having to worry about money, I might view small business owners as greedy little tyrants who exploit their staff by only offering minimum wage. I might believe that capitalism is greatly flawed, and that individual freedoms obstruct my vision of what society should be. I might even try to find a way to alter the system so that small businesses are run by the government, but without calling it fascism. If my father was an admirer of communist regimes, I might be influenced to share in his admiration. If I wanted to be a dictator, I would have to either create an emergency or would have to be lucky enough to have an emergency occur during my reign as Prime Minister. Only with a national sense of emergency would the Canadian public allow me to expand my ministerial power. The greater the sense of fear felt by the public, the more accepting they would be of my expanding powers. Under the Emergency Measures Act, I would be able to achieve my goals. If I wanted to be a dictator, I would relish the emergency and do everything I could to prolong the crisis for as long as possible. The longer the crisis lasts, the more my power could expand. If I wanted to be a dictator, I'd have to sell the idea to people in such a way that they resist as little as possible. I would loudly condemn any criticism of authoritarian governments which are operating in a fashion that I would prefer to operate. If I was determined to become a dictator, I would proclaim my moral superiority over my adversaries so as to condemn any dissent as immoral. I would place strong restrictions on both social media and protests by limiting both free speech and the right to assembly. I would call these freedoms dangerous to the public good. I would implement new laws to limit liberties, which I call temporary. But in reality, they would be no more temporary than income tax was during its temporary implementation after World War II. At the earliest opportunity, I would seize as many firearms as possible from the public so as to minimize the possibility for armed resistance. I would find a way to make the seizure of arms appear to be in their best interests. If I was determined to be a dictator, much of the public would need to be on my side. To that end, I would provide government funding for them, which circumstance would force them to accept. After just a few months, they would become dependent on the government relief funding. The more dependent they became, the more compliant they would be. The more compliant they became, the more my power could expand. Whether they loved me or hated me, they wouldn't want to risk losing the funding which allowed them to survive. If I were to be a dictator, I would hire a tech firm to mine the internet for data which would identify potential resistors. The list would reveal both those with the most influence and those who could lead an armed resistance. I would start by monitoring all Army veterans, especially those with combat experience who are the most outspoken. I would create as much tension and civil unrest as possible so as to foster a volatile environment. The more volatile, the more likely it would be for a trigger event to happen. Once a trigger event occurs, such as an armed response or a violent protest, then I would have the excuse I would need to implement martial law. Under martial law, I would have all the tools which I would require to institute a permanent dictatorship. To maintain my power, I would have a zero-tolerance policy for any and all dissent. Anyone who would question my authority would be immediately labeled as a conspiracy theorist, arrested, and jailed for subversive activity. Only with absolute control over the masses would I be able to recreate our entire society into what I know to be the right way. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and other world leaders are currently on the path to absolute power. Now is the time to ask ourselves, are we okay with this? If not, what are we prepared to do so that we can avoid this dark potential future?